Welcome to the lesson on what is globalization and how did we get here. The term globalization has been used to describe everything from the spread of popular music, movies, sports, and fashion to the increasing ease of communication and transportation. However, economic globalization refers to increased interconnectedness of markets in different countries. This kind of globalization is reflected in the growth in international trade and foreign investment, and especially in the rise in the international flow of money across borders to provide loans and to purchase assets such as foreign stocks and bonds, foreign companies, real estate, and factories. Economic globalization results in more direct investment, imports, and exports. For instance, when Ford Motor Company builds a factory to produce engines in Chihuahua, Mexico, this is called foreign direct investment. When Ford ships the engines produced in Mexico up to its assembly operation in Detroit, that is a Mexican export and a U.S. import, even though the exchange occurs within a single company. When a New York-based bank such as J.P. Morgan Chase hires a firm in Bangalore, India to provide its telephone operations, managing accounts or selling new services, this is an Indian export and a U.S. import. We often think of globalization as a recent phenomenon, but in fact, countries and companies have sought to engage internationally for many centuries. In the Middle Ages, trade routes stretched for thousands of miles across Europe, the Middle East, Asia, and North Africa. By the early 1500s, the era of merchant capitalism had begun, with most of the major kingdoms in Europe establishing trading companies, complete with fleets of ships and financing to purchase goods overseas to bring home for sale and profit. Merchant capitalism from 1500 to around 1750 was an era of globalization. The pursuit of profits from overseas involvement ranged from trading goods to territorial control and colonization to trading in humans. The trading companies that undertook this early form of globalization were chartered by governments and often raised capital through stock offerings. Colonial control, established in the era of merchant capitalism, continued well into the 20th century and was connected to two other historically important features of globalization. One is the transatlantic slave trade. According to one report, by the end of the 18th century, at least 150 privately owned ships a year were leaving Liverpool, England for Africa, and then for the other side of the Atlantic. From 1790 to 1800, Britain shipped about 400,000 slaves across the ocean, and the sale of slaves accounted for 75% of British foreign income. Slaves were taken in West and Southern Africa and were shipped across the Atlantic Ocean, mainly to Brazil, the Caribbean, and the United States. Slave labor, unpaid and worked to the bone, means low production costs for the cotton, tobacco, sugar, and other commodities they produced. This meant expanded production of these goods, and since they were shipped around the world, they supported an expansion of global trade. Another aspect of globalization that thrived in the late 19th and early 20th century was international lending by banks. Financial institutions from the colonial powers were lending actively to industrial interests in their colonies. These loans allowed countries to undertake large investment projects, often under the control of the colonial ruler. They would also create the burden of international loan repayment, which would create difficulties at times for some countries. The defining feature of the 19th century is the massive process of industrialization that occurred in Europe and North America. This brought innovation in machinery and equipment production, including transportation equipment. This latter made international trade less costly at the same time that the industrializing North had a growing thirst for raw materials and commodities. As a result, trade flows followed a specific structure, with the industrializing countries of Europe and North America exporting manufactured goods and developing countries, and at this point we're speaking mainly about colonies, exporting in return their natural resources or raw materials. This period, beginning in around 1820, is sometimes referred to as the first wave of globalization. Colonialism helped support this, as it created a set of captive markets to support the trade pattern needed for industrialization in Europe especially. This 19th century wave of globalization came to a rapid halt with the onset of World War I and effectively stalled out until the end of World War II. The The two world wars and the period in between were a period of great conflict, but also of great instability in international relations, and thus in the degree of economic engagement among countries. They were also characterized by uncertainty over how the world economy would be governed and by whom. Economic globalization declined as a result in this interwar period, and it was only during the relatively peaceful period after the end of World War II that globalization surged again. In this lesson, we discuss the historical roots of globalization and the international regulatory system. In the next lesson, we will explore the golden age of capitalism and the second wave of globalization.